अस्सलाम वालेकुम दोस्तों। आज जो मैं कहानी आपको सुनाने जा रहा हूँ वो है मशहूर ज़माना कातिल जैक द रिपर की, जिसने किए थे कुल 5 कत्ल।
5 murders. These murders are known as the canonical 5, and what that means is simply these are the murders that are widely believed to have been carried out by this sinister serial killer known as Jack the Ripper.
हम उन जगहों पर भी जाएंगे जहाँ पर जैक द रिपर ने उन औरतों का बेदर्दी से कत्ल किया था, और उस दौर में मिलने वाले शवाहिद और सबूतों की बिना पर हम अंदाज़ा लगाएंगे कि कौन हो सकता है जैक द रिपर। तो आए चलते हैं 19वीं सदी में और ढूंढते हैं जैक द रिपर
Of the 19th century. So right now we're just by Gateway DLR Station. Tower Gate, the original gate that used to be here, was originally one of the main entry points into the city of London, or Londinium, as it was known almost 2,000 years ago by the Romans. After numerous attempts to conquer this land, the Romans finally succeeded in the year 43 AD and gave this city the name Londinium. The course of the centuries is evolved to London as we know it today. Now, we're going to be focusing on London during the 1800s. More specifically, the year 1888.
1888 इसलिए क्योंकि इस साल जैक द रिपर ने 5 औरतों का कत्ल किया, वो भी 3 महीने के अंदर। 31 अगस्त 1888 से लेकर 9 नवंबर 1888, 3 महीने में 5 औरतों का कत्ल, वो भी व्हाइटचैपल में जैक द रिपर ने किया।
During the 1800s, London saw mass migration. Thousands and thousands of people came flooding to London with this rags to riches dream. Now at the time, London was considered to be the capital of the world. Not only that, it was at the very heart of the industrial revolution taking place during this time, so there was all kinds of new factories and mills opening up over on the east end of the city, and many people from abroad saw that as an opportunity to come here and provide a better life for themselves and of course their families. Sadly,
मगर किस्मत हर एक पे मेहरबान नहीं थी, और उस वक्त भी कुछ लोग गुर्बत और अफलास की जिंदगी गुजार रहे थे। क्योंकि वो शहर में रहने के काबिल नहीं थे, इसलिए उनका मस्कन शहर का मज़ाफ़ाती इलाका था, जो उस वक्त व्हाइटचैपल था।
Now, one of these districts people were pushed into was Whitechapel. Now, Whitechapel today is a very trendy, very edgy part of the city. You might see a few hipsters walking around the area tonight. If anyone doesn't know what a hipster looks like, just look for pointy shoes, long, tight trousers, swept back hair. If anyone is looking for a hipster, just look for the pointy shoes, tight trousers, swept back hair and a bushy beard. Now, that will apply to some women that you will see in the area tonight, but don't worry, they are friendly, most of them, I believe. I haven't met all of them. Now, Whitechapel during the 1800s, when we're talking about Whitechapel, was no laughing matter.
उस दौर में रोशनी का कोई खास इंतजाम सड़कों पे नहीं होता था, स्ट्रीट लाइट्स भी कोई खास नहीं होती थी। इसके अलावा बहुत ज़्यादा कोहर और धुंध होती थी कि इंसान अपने हाथ की उंगलियां भी नहीं दिख सकता, और यही वजह थी कि जैक द रिपर को एक बहुत अच्छा मौका मिला ये भयानक और शफ़ाफ काम करने का।
And awful murders. Now, usually a lot of people come on the tour and they wonder why Jack the Ripper is so famous, how come he's so well known, not just in England or in Europe, but all over the world. For this, I believe there are 2 main reasons. So the first is the time period this killer committed these crimes. Now, at the very turn of the century, there's a lot of changes that happened in the world, especially in communication. The telephone had just been invented in 1876. Not only that, but there was a revolutionary technological advancement in the printing press. Newspapers were now being steam pressed, which meant a lot more papers were able to be printed, which meant a lot of more people were able to figure out and know exactly what was happening within their communities, and of course on a national and more in an international scale as well. All these new ways of communicating between one another made it possible to document the Jack the Ripper murders in a way that no other crime or murder had ever been documented before in our history. The other reason? The mystery. Who is Jack the Ripper? I believe that question might have led you here tonight on this very tour. Hopefully by the end of the tour you will have a better idea to the answer yourselves.
From Tower Gateway, I'm moving towards the first place where Jack the Ripper did his murder.
Now, I like to start stories from the beginning. Usually I find that's the best place to start them, naturally. So I'm going to take you back now to the night of the 31st of August 1888. Summer weather had long gone and the night was filled with torrential rain and flashes of lightning from a thunderstorm happening that night. Now around 12:30 a.m. a woman by the name of Mary Ann Nichols, or more locally referred to and known as Polly Ann Nichols, was seen leaving the Frying Pan pub. Polly was described as a weathered girl. What do I mean by that? Well, she had a scar across her face, she had gout in her leg, she was a rather large lady. She was very, very popular among the men in Whitechapel. They would say, oh, good old Polly gets through a dozen gents a day. She does. Now, that already gives you an indication as to how hard these women had to work in order to make a living out here. And before I continue with the tour, I'm just going to point out now that the people that I speak about on the tour tonight, especially the women that I speak about, were real people. And we've got to be very mindful and respectful of that. These women were full of life and character. They were daughters. Some of them were mothers. Some of them were wives that had been kicked out of their houses by their husbands, kicked out into the streets with no valuables, no possessions of any kind in their name. And if they didn't want to spend the night out on the streets, they would have had to go to a doss house. The doss houses cost money. And the most common way for a lot of women that were out on the streets in their situation was through prostitution. And unfortunately, that's what many of the women ended up doing. Now, a doss house that I mentioned before, doss houses were old British lodging houses back then, where people could go there, pay a certain fee, and they'd be able to stay there for up to one night at a time. So every single day you'd have to come back and you'd have to pay again. You couldn't just book it for like a whole week or something. It wasn't like a hostel or hotel. And there were different ways you could spend this night in a doss house. Now, the most expensive, and I guess the most comfortable way, quotations on the word comfortable, would be if you paid 6p for a double room. But don't get too excited, it's not double room as you'd imagine it today. It's not a Premier Inn or Travel Lodge or anything like that. It was actually closer to a single room that had a mattress on the floor, millimeters thick. Probably even infested with lice or even fleas, depending on who slept on it the nights before you did. That was your best offer. Now, your next best offer was something called the coffin rooms. They would cost you about 4p. I don't think the coffin rooms require any further explaining. I'll just let your imagination take you away on that. The most affordable and the most popular way to spend this night in a doss house for many people in Whitechapel was the boardroom. Boardroom was just essentially a very large walk-in cupboard. It was a large walk-in closet. It would cost you about 2p. The landlord would stack as many people as he could into this tiny room. When he couldn't fit anymore, he'd close the doors and you'd spend the night sleeping, standing up, wedged in between, could even be up to 30, maybe even up to 50 people, all standing up, clustered together, depending on the size of the boardroom of that doss house. Not the most comfortable way to spend your night, but it was the most affordable. Now, there was one last option, and that was a very last resort for many people in that situation, and that was something called roping. Roping cost you 1p. This is a real thing, it actually existed. It's where the landlord would tie a piece of rope like so. After you paid your penny, you'd hang yourself over the rope, and that is how you slept. Genuinely. Now, on more occasions than others, this wasn't even inside. If the doss house had a courtyard out in the back somewhere, it would be done out there. So there wasn't even a guarantee of having a roof over your head. But it was a little bit safer than spending it out on the streets, in the open streets, with everything that you had on there. Let's go back to Polly Ann Nichols. She was seen being thrown out these one of these doss houses around 1:30 in the morning because she didn't have enough money to stay there. Now, as she left the doss house, she shouted back to the deputy of the doss house, "I've got a jolly bonnet on now, I'll find that doss money." So she simply meant she was going to go out into that storm that was taking place that night, find a customer to sleep with, come back and pay for the room in that doss house where she wanted to stay that night. Now, she left that doss house, walked for about 3/4 of a mile from this area over in that direction, over to a place known as Bucks Row. Bucks Row today no longer exists. You won't find it on any map. You won't find it on Google. It is actually now known as Durward Street. We aren't going there on tonight's tour because it's very far out of our way. There's nothing interesting to see there anymore. It is actually now used as a car park. So unless you're a car park watcher enthusiast, that's the only thing you're missing out on. Apart from that, there's nothing else there. But she was discovered in what was used to be Bucks Row by two carters. Carters were people who would operate horse-drawn carriages and cars. Now, these two men were going down Bucks Row early that morning, getting ready for the day of business ahead. When about halfway down, they can sense that something is there. Something is in the middle of the ground, on the middle of the road, on the ground. Something that's not moving. Remember, it's pitch black conditions. They don't know what it is, so they slow down. They become very cautious and concerned. As they get closer and closer and closer, eventually when they get so close to what appears to be someone sleeping, they discover that it is the body of Polly Ann Nichols. She had been murdered on Bucks Road. She was found on her back. Her throat had been strangled to death. She had also been sliced all the way across from left to right with about a 6 to 8 inch blade in length. Her skirt had been lifted up over her knees and she had been stabbed viciously in her abdomen. Now these two men who found her decided to leave her there and carry on their way. The reason being that they didn't want to be late for work. So I admire a good work ethic, as I'm sure the rest of you here do as well. One thing I can guarantee you though, if I found a corpse on my way to work, I'm really sorry, I would not be here with you tonight. I would be traumatized. Personally, I don't deal very well with blood. It's not a good sign if it's found out of the body. I believe that it should be kept inside. Now, I have this privilege today. These two men did not have this privilege. Even missing just one day's wages, if you had to work in Whitechapel back in the 1888 was life or death for many people. So they did, unfortunately, have to leave her there and carried on their way. Now, on their way to work, they did see a police officer, a man called Jonas Misen. They report their findings to PC Misen. He doubles back to towards Bucks Row and he officially pronounces Polly Ann Nichols dead at 3:45 a.m. Now, with the first victim, it's only right that I introduce the first suspect of tonight. A man called Montague John Druitt. Montague John Druitt. Quite a very British name, I would say. Montague John Druitt. Mr. Druitt was a school teacher and solicitor back at the time. His father was a very reputable surgeon here in the city. This building here on my left, just above the Chamberlain pub, this white one here, this used to be his father's old surgery and offices. That actually used to be his father's surgery. Now, that detail alone led many people to then believe that Montague Druitt would have had a very good knowledge of this area growing up as a child. As a kid, after he finished school, he would come here to his father's office, wait for him to finish work so they could go home together. Now, his father died in 1885. His mother later died in the summer of 1888, just the summer before these murders started taking place. And those who knew Montague Druitt said that he dealt with his parents' deaths quite admirably. However, that wasn't actually the case, because by the end of 1888, on the 31st of December, Montague Druitt's body was found dead, washed up on the banks of the River Thames over in West London near Chiswick. If anyone knows where Chiswick is, the police, when they found his body, they found rocks stuffed inside his jacket pockets. Later, when they went to check his apartment, they found a suicide note saying, "I've gone the way of mother." Now, his mother died from mental illnesses. He was first brought up as a suspect in the Ripper murders, in the Ripper investigation, by an inspector who was looking into the murders at the time, a man called Melville Macnaughton. And Inspector Macnaughton writes of these suspicions of his in a memorandum he wrote at the time, and this is a direct quote. He wrote, "I've always had my reservations on Montague John Druitt. I believe he was the murderer. His family believed he was the murderer, and he was sexually insane." Sexually insane. Now, that allegation comes from a dismissal at the school where Mr. Druitt used to teach. There was an incident involving him having sexually abused one of the female students there. That was simply a rumor. There was no evidence, no proof of any kind to support that particular allegation, but that was enough for Mr. Macnaughton and a lot of other people looking into the case to believe that Mr. Druitt would then come here after he lost his job, come here back into Whitechapel, commit these violent murders on these women, and at the end of it, kill himself because he felt guilty, out of guilt. Now, I don't claim to be a Jack the Ripper expert. By that, I simply mean I did not go to university to study Jack the Ripper. And if you like, you actually can go to university and study Ripperology. It's a real course. It's called Ripperology. Now, obviously, if you go to university and you study Ripperology and you graduate, you officially then are known as a Ripperologist. For a moment, whoever this killer is, even if it is Mr. Druitt, would have a shred of guilt or even remorse of having killed these women. And as I describe the rest of the murders tonight to you, hopefully you will begin to agree with me. Feel free to disagree. I'd be very interested in the case that you have to build. All right, we're going to continue. We're going to go down this street all the way to the end. I'm going to take you into Aldgate Square, where there's this beautiful church just on the side of it that I want to talk to you about. Welcome to Aldgate Square. Yeah, now as I said, we are here to talk about that particular building. Over there is that beautiful church just to my left here. That is St. Botolph Church. St. Botolph Church. St. Botolph Church has been a religious site here for over 1,000 years now. It had some renovation work done to it in the sort of the late 18th century, which is why it wears this sort of Gothic look that it still wears today. But back in 1888, this entire area, this church, was actually known by another name. People used to call this church Prostitute Island. And that's because if you were to come here any given night of the week, you would be able to find yourself about 100, sometimes 200, and there have been accounts of up to 300 prostitutes all soliciting business from this one location around this church here. Now I can already see a few minds begin to wonder and tick, why would prostitutes be soliciting business outside of a church? It's not exactly their clientele, shall we say. The simple answer is this: they found a loophole in the justice system. Now, prostitution back in 1888 was illegal. However, it was also illegal for the police back then to arrest anyone on holy ground. So, anytime these prostitutes saw a police officer coming nearby in the area, they would literally all gather and jump into the church grounds, figuratively speaking, of course, and the police couldn't do a single thing about it, apart from maybe standing here shaking their fists and swearing until the morning hours. But by law, the police were not legally allowed to arrest any of the prostitutes as long as they were inside the church grounds. Yeah. Now, since I brought up the topic of the police, let's talk a little bit about them, because they play quite a crucial role, I would say, in the investigation of the Ripper murders. London actually has two police forces. Not many people know this. There are two police forces here in London. So we're not actually in Whitechapel just yet. Right now we're still inside the old City of London district. We are going to head into Whitechapel soon. I'll let you know when we do that. But the City of London district has its very own police force. They are known as the City of London Police Force. I know it's a very creative name. They came up with it themselves back when they started, whereas the rest of London, or Greater London as we know it today, is covered by the Metropolitan Police Force, or the Met, or Scotland Yard. They are all exactly the same police force. Scotland Yard is exactly Metropolitan Police Force. Now, the Metropolitan Police Force cover Whitechapel. Since one of the murders of the canonical five technically was discovered and found inside the City of London, that particular murder brought these two police forces working on the same case at the exact same time. Now, today these two forces work together. They share evidence, they share information. You wouldn't really be able to tell the difference between them apart from maybe the uniform that they wear. One way to know, by the way, that you're in the old City of London and not the rest or Greater London is from these bollards. If you look over there, just those bollards there at the top, you'll see that they're painted in white and red tops. You will only find those bollards like that in the City of London. Everywhere else in Greater London, they're just black tops. And there also is the same color for the police forces. So City of London Police Force, their colors are red and white, whereas Metropolitan Police Force colors are blue and white. Someone did try to correct me and say it was black and white. It is not. It's just a very, 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 very dark blue. Trust me, I looked it up on the Metropolitan Police Force website. It just looks black from a distance, but it is in fact a dark blue. Now, today they work together. Back then, they did not work together. If they saw one another on the streets, they would greet each other by throwing their hats at the other officer. They would throw their batons. They would grab beer bottles outside of the pubs and throw those as well at the opposing officer. Even occasionally, if they were actually in groups, they would instigate full-on street violence. They hated each other. Now, as a member of the public, you're probably thinking, good God, how does one cope, not just with the poverty, the living conditions, the overpopulated area of Whitechapel that is already infested and poor, but the police fighting on the streets, out in the open, in the public's eyes. How would one cope? Alcohol. Lots and lots of alcohol. They downed their sorrows. They drunk their sorrows away. Now, if you were to go to a pub in 1888 and ask for a tall glass of gin, you'd be looking at about the price of about 2 to 3 pence. Pretty good, especially if you like gin. This guy likes gin. Coincidentally enough, if you were to approach a prostitute in 1888, the going rate would also be about 2 to 3 pence. 2 So you can maybe start to see a small pattern developing. What these prostitutes would do is they would grab a customer and then go grab a drink. Grab another customer, grab a drink. They're repeating that two-step process all day until hopefully by the end of the night they would have remembered to save a little bit of money on the side just so they can afford to pay for a doll's house later on that evening. Now, let's go a little bit back. Let's go back onto the subject of the police. I want to talk to you about certain tools they had available to them at the time to help in their investigations, like forensics. Forensics was very much in its infancy back then. The police could not tell the difference between human blood or pig's blood. In 1888, could not tell the difference. The only real evidence that they could actually use for their investigation were eyewitness testimonies. When someone would see something, they would then describe that event later back to the police. The human memory is a very fragile thing, especially if alcohol has been involved somewhere along the timeline. Events tend to blur, shall we say. The witnesses that gave their statements to the police on the Ripper murders, these people were all intoxicated. So there was a lot of contradictions, there was a lot of discrepancies and inconsistencies in the reports themselves, which made it very difficult for the police to have a true timeline of events of what happened to the victim and what happened that night exactly. I'm going to go on to talk to you about something called the night of the double event now. This is a very crucial night because a lot of things happen just before this night and then just a few days after, which all kind of correlate and come back and are connected by that particular evening. Before I do, I'm just going to point out now, I won't be covering the victims themselves in chronological order. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The reason for that is it doesn't make a very good walking tour. So yeah, so I won't be covering the murders in chronological order, but I will be covering all 5 victims. I will be giving a nice clear perspective at the end of the tour, just so you have everything summarized at the end of the tour. So the night of the double event, the night that Jack the Ripper claimed the lives of not just 1 but 2 victims within a very short space, about 45 minutes apart. The first was a lady called Elizabeth Stride. Now Elizabeth had just been recently divorced earlier that year, and she was fortunate enough to receive a divorce settlement. Now after she started receiving that settlement, she met a new man. They fell in love together very quickly and decided to move and live together as well. Now shortly after they moved in together, Elizabeth stopped receiving that divorce settlement. And when her boyfriend found out at the time, well, he had a change of heart. He decided that he no longer wanted to be with Elizabeth. Instead, what he decided was that he was going to keep the apartment, the room that they were renting, she was going to be put onto the streets. And that's exactly what happened. So, what does Elizabeth Stride do? Being out on the streets, with valuables and possessions, while she turns to prostituting herself to make a living. So on the night of the 30th of September, 1888, the 30th of September, she comes right here to Prostitute Island so she can make some money that night. We have an account of this night by a man known as Israel Schwartz. Israel Schwartz was a Jewish man. He lived here locally in the area. He claims that he saw Elizabeth that night talking to what he described as a very strange and peculiar man. He described this man as being 5'10" in height. He had blonde hair. He was wearing a hat. No, it is not me. Before you start putting all 3 things together, I do have blonde hair. I am also wearing a hat, and I am 5'10". Because the Israel Schwartz also said that he was wearing the uniform of a soldier or a sailor. And this was actually one of the police's very first real clues into having some sort of profile or identity for who Jack the Ripper might actually be. Just south of here, we have London's first Docklands. So anything that was being brought into London back then, anything that was being imported, was coming in on ships. And I'm talking about hundreds and hundreds of ships coming in through the River Thames into London. These people were coming in completely undocumented and unregulated. I'm talking about sailors, soldiers, all different kinds of trading merchants coming into the East End of London, docking here for about 3 to 4 months at a time, sometimes even up to a year. And then at the end of it, just jump onto a ship and sail off to their next place of business. If you recall what I said at the beginning, the Ripper murders happened within about 3 months, from the 31st of August to the 9th of November. So it is possible that Jack the Ripper could have come on one of these ships, stayed here in this area of Whitechapel, committed these violent murders, and at the end just jumped onto a ship and sailed off to his next place of business. Now there are reports to suggest that he continued murdering in different countries altogether, but we aren't going to be covering those. We're going to be just covering the 5 that happened here in London. Now, let's go back to Israel Schwartz. He said that he saw Elizabeth talking to this man in this square back then, on that night of the 30th of September, at which point an argument develops. This man was said to have struck Elizabeth down to the ground. She falls down and he begins to repeatedly kick her whilst she's down there. Mr. Schwartz becomes very nervous, he becomes very startled. He does the only natural thing he could think of. He runs away home. Not the most noblest of actions, but that is what he does. Now, he does eventually report this to the police. However, it was 4 days after the event itself happened. I'm sure by this point you already know it was 4 days too late. Elizabeth Stride was found that night by a carter, a jeweler in fact. He found her about exactly 1 a.m. He was on his way down Henrik Street, which is again about half a mile over in that direction, where all of a sudden his horse stops. Completely stops. Doesn't budge. The jeweler tries to get his horse to move. He doesn't move. He doesn't respond to this to the actions. Now, frustrated in his angry state, the jeweler jumps off the car, grabs his gas lantern, and comes right to the horse's face. And when he looks down at the horse's hooves, what is he to find but the remains and the body of Elizabeth Stride? She had been strangled to death. Her throat was cut all the way across from left to right with a 6 to 8 inch blade in length. Blood was seeping from her wound, the body at the time. Now, when this jeweler gave his report to the police later that night, he remembered a very crucial detail. He remembered that he bent down to see and hear if by any miracle, Elizabeth Stride was still breathing, if there was any way that they could save her. As he did that, he remembered he heard footsteps. He heard footsteps behind him, running away from the scene. Now, I can't tell you if Jack the Ripper was a soldier or a sailor. I can tell you he did kill again that very same night, just 45 minutes later, over in a place called Mitre Square. So, if you want to know about the next victim, follow me to Mitre Square now. I'll tell you about her when we get there. Just walk in London, know exactly what I'm talking about. It changes every single day. One of the places that's been affected most by these changes, especially on the tour that we're on tonight, is where we're standing right now in Mitre Square. So if you were here just 5 years ago, back in 2014, this entire area actually used to be cobbled streets. This black building towering above us right now did not exist 5 years ago, simply was not here. There was actually a school here at the time when the victim was found, but that was later destroyed in the 1940s during the Blitz by German bombing planes. Before anyone asks, I actually have had this question twice on 2 separate tours. I feel like I need to address it now just because of the frequency of it. There were no CCTV cameras to capture anything from the night of the 30th of September 1888. You laugh, but it's true. 2 very lovely people saw one particular camera and asked if it happened to catch any of the events where it happened to catch the killer escaping and fleeing from the scene. Now, just in case you didn't know, I did actually do this in my research. The first time CCTV was used, in the way that we use it today, the first time it was ever used, that might actually surprise you, it's as far back as to 1942. It was actually first used by Nazi scientists during the war to monitor their missile launchers. That was the first time it was used. I was expecting maybe late 50s, early 60s. It's as far back as to the early 40s. So for that technology to exist even 60 years before that is a bit of a stretch of the imagination, even for an actor. The lady that I want to talk to you about here is was called Catherine Eddowes. Catherine Eddowes was said to be an incredibly feisty and an extremely fierce woman. And we know that she was fierce because that night, on the 30th of September, she spent the whole day drinking at the pub, getting drunk, and she was arrested as soon as she stepped out of the pub for being drunk and disorderly. She stepped out of the pub, saw a man across the road, walking along. She started to abuse and shout abuse at this poor man. This poor man turned out to be the constable of Bishopsgate Police Station. And he was on duty at that time. He was not in the greatest of moods. So he crossed across the road, took Catherine Eddowes, arrested her for being drunk and disorderly, and took her all the way to Bishopsgate Police Station, where he threw her in a cell until she sobered up. Now, they did release her a few minutes just before 1 a.m. Not because she was sober, Well, because she continued to hurl and abuse this poor man from her cell. Now that's about 6 to 7 hours of shouting abuse and taking abuse. That's more than anyone can take. At this point, the constable just got fed up. He released her just to get her out of his sights. If you recall, 1 a.m. was the time that Elizabeth Stride's body was just being found passed by the jeweler. Now, if the police had that information, they could have potentially saved Catherine Eddowes' life by keeping her at the police station just 20, 50, let's just even say just 10 minutes longer than they did. But they didn't have the information. They released her a few minutes before 1 a.m. She left the station that night and shouted one final goodbye to the constable. "Good night, old cock!" Cock was a slang word that was used to describe a police officer back at the time. Another couple of slang words that was used to, or nicknames they referred to police officers were bobbies and peelies, simply because of Robert Peel. Robert Peel founded the Metropolitan Police Force back in the early 1800s. So that's where those two nicknames come from. Now, she shouted that, ran away from Bishopsgate Station, came here into Mitre Square, presumably on her way to Prostitute Island herself, so she can also maybe find a customer that night. But she never quite made it that far. Now, when I talk about police reports in tonight's tour, you might notice there are a few inconsistencies or contradictions in the reports themselves, and you're probably right. It's because there are a lot of contradictions in the reporting itself. Now, one of the reasons, rather, that the police gave at the time was that they were incredibly understaffed and extremely overworked. So if that excuse sounds a little too familiar, it's probably because you probably hear it today, especially in hospitality. If anyone here works in hospitality, that excuse is used pretty much every day. I speak from first-hand experience on that. There was a certain truth to that particular reason for the police. Let's take, for example, an officer who was working that night, a man called Edward Watkins. PC Watkins started his beat just before 10 p.m. from Bishopsgate Station. He continued that beat until the discovery of Catherine Eddowes' body. He was then told to continue walking that beat until 9 a.m. the next morning. That's about 10 to 11 hours of work. That's pretty long even in today's world, especially if this poor man had to walk the same beat. So a police officer's beat. A beat is simply the area that the police officer would patrol, the route that he would take. So his route, his beat, would start from Bishopsgate Station. He would make his way onto Duke Street, come here into Mitre Square, circle around the square, and then head back towards the station. That entire route took him approximately 15 minutes. 7.5 minutes here, 7.5 minutes back to the station. At 1:30 a.m., PC Watkins was here in Mitre Square with nothing to report. He then comes back just 15 minutes later at 1:45, where he discovers the eviscerated and dismembered body of Catherine Eddowes. This is the part of the tour where I have to put a small disclaimer, because it is going to get quite gory and gruesome in terms of the descriptions of the murders. If anyone here in the group tonight is a little bit squeamish, I'm not really sure why you're on a Jack the Ripper tour, because unfortunately that's all we're talking about tonight. I haven't had anyone faint or anything, but just brace yourselves, because it is going to get quite gory from this point onwards. PC Watkins comes back at Mitre Square, into Mitre Square at 1:45, and discovers Catherine Eddowes' body. She was lying on her back. She had been strangled to death. Her throat was cut all the way across from left to right with a 6 to 8 inch blade in length. That is the third time I've said those details. The police did have autopsies back then to help in their investigations. Autopsies were around, they were being used, but again, there was very limited information they could find from these autopsies. But they were able to conclude and determine that the cuts and incisions made on the victims' bodies were made with about a 6 to 8 inch blade in length, something that could very easily cut and slice into flesh as well. Also, there is this theory that the killer might have been left-handed, simply from the way that the cuts were made. I also happen to be left-handed, but I'm not wearing a sailor's uniform or a soldier's uniform, just so you know. As well as the throat being sliced, the Ripper even went a step even further than the previous victims. He ripped her open straight down the middle of her torso, pulled her apart, ripped out her intestines and placed them over her head and over her shoulders. Her uterus had been brutally mutilated. Her earlobes had actually been cut and sliced off. Her face was so badly beaten and cut that the report said that when the police tried to move her body the next morning, as they picked up her body, the tip of her nose slid off her face onto the ground. Not only that, but the Ripper took it even one step further than that. He ripped out one of her kidneys and removed it from the scene altogether. The police never found one of Catherine Eddowes' kidneys. Now we have here the most brutal, most violent murder so far. Now a lot of information came from this particular murder, from this victim. Unfortunately, that information came much later than the investigation itself. And it was when people themselves started to look at how much time Jack the Ripper had to commit this particular murder. 15 minutes. How do we know this? Well, the police officer's report. He was here at 1:30 a.m., didn't see a thing. He then claims that he was back here at 1:45 and discovers Catherine Eddowes in the way that I just described to you a moment ago. Yet in such a short space of time and very, very low-lit conditions, this killer manages to showcase very intricate details of anatomy. So from that, the theory that the killer or Jack the Ripper may have been a surgeon or a doctor or at least had some sort of medical training was then put forward as a potential profile. And from this point we get the telltale signs of what makes a Ripper victim. How can we distinguish a Ripper murder from any other murder that happens at the same time? First of all, Jack the Ripper only killed women. These women were all prostitutes. They were between the ages of 35 to 47 years of age, with the exception of one, who I will talk about later in the tour. You will find she was considerably younger than the other victims. Now, the way that a typical night would go for Jack the Ripper is he would go out, find himself a prostitute around this area, Whitechapel. That prostitute would then lead him into a dark, secluded area, such as Mitre Square was back at the time. And as that prostitute begins to lift up her skirts, Jack the Ripper would start strangling her to death. Once he strangled her to death, he would then slice her throat all the way across. Again, that particular way of doing things does show knowledge of blood flow in the body. The fact that he strangled them to death would reduce the blood flow, so when he sliced the throat, it would prevent the spillage, that much spillage of her blood. After he cut the throat, he would then proceed to mutilate the bodies further by tearing them open, particularly the uterus. That is what he usually went for. Elizabeth Stride, who I just spoke about by the church, she would have her uterus or any of her torso ripped apart. She only had her throat cut. For that reason, the police gave her the nickname Lucky Liz. Yeah, I wouldn't consider it lucky to have been murdered in the first place, but the police seem to think it was lucky. I guess she was, compared to what happened to the other women. But that was a very interesting detail, because if you think back to what I said about the last thing I said about the carter, the jeweler who found her, when he was talking to the police, he heard footsteps running away from the scene. Now, from that, there is a theory that Jack the Ripper might have been interrupted with the murder of Elizabeth Stride. And of course, not wanting to be caught, he fled the scene, feeling unsatisfied with the job he didn't get to finish that night. He then stumbles on Catherine Eddowes just a few moments later and finishes the job exactly as he intended to, perhaps on Elizabeth Stride, on Miss Eddowes here in Mitre Square. Now that explains two things. One, why Elizabeth Stride's body hadn't been tampered with any further than her throat being cut. It also explains as to why this was the only night Jack the Ripper claimed two victims and killed two women within a short space of time, 45 minutes apart. Jack the Ripper was not known for leaving many clues at his crime scenes. He pretty much made it increasingly difficult for the police to have any real lead in their investigation. But on this particular night, he did actually not so much leave a clue, he kind of took something away from the scene. As well as that kidney of Catherine Eddowes, he took a piece of her apron that she was wearing. Now he took that blood-stained apron over, and it was found over in a place called Golson Street, and he placed it there along with something else, something that would spark off one of the biggest conspiracy theories that this case has to offer you. So if that piques your interest, and you want to know about that conspiracy theory, I'll take you to Golson Street now, and I'll tell you about it over there, just this way, through this passage. What is more likely than this being the prettiest part of London you've ever seen is that we've probably just retraced the steps of Jack the Ripper from that night, the night of the 30th of September 1888. So if you recall, the last thing I spoke about was that he took a piece of Catherine Eddowes' apron, her clothing. He brought that apron over here to Golson Street. He placed it on a water pump just across the road, somewhere in between this Happy Days traditional fish and chip shop and that blue shutter there with a white sign above it that says Andrews Commercial Property Management. In all the times I've ever done this tour, and any other time of the week, any other time of the day, that I've walked up down Golson Street, I've never once seen that place open for business. I'm not sure I would trust Andrew with my commercial property, and I would strongly advise everyone here not to trust him with any of your commercial property you might have. He does provide 2 telephone numbers, landline and mobile, for your convenience should he be overseas, but it seems a bit of a dubious enterprise. Nevertheless, that is where the water pump was situated. That's where it was found. That's where the piece of apron was, along with that something else that I teased you with. A piece of graffiti scribbled in chalk just on the wall behind the pump. Now, that might not seem that unusual because you're probably looking around and you're thinking, well, Victor, we're surrounded by graffiti. Some good, in Andrew's case, some not so good. We've got to understand that graffiti didn't really become a thing until about the 1970s. It started in New York City, street art. It then became very popular and made its way over to London sometime in the 1980s. So for graffiti to exist in the 1880s, it was just very much out of place. It did not look natural. It was discovered here by a very important figure of the Metropolitan Police Force, a man called Charles Warren, Police Chief Charles Warren of the Metropolitan Police. He was on Golson Street, he stumbled upon the piece of apron with that graffiti, and he decides to call and bring a photographer down here to Golson Street early that morning so the photographer can take a picture of it, so that Mr. Warren could have it later for his investigation to refer back to it should he need it for any evidence of any kind. Now, photography were not cameras, were not these small devices that we all carry about in our pockets today. They were much larger, much heavier pieces of equipment. They would take hours to set up, about 2 to 3 hours. This photographer came down here to Golson Street early that morning, half asleep, sets his camera up, spends for 2 hours getting it ready. As soon as he's ready to take the shot, Charles Warren turns to him and says, actually, do you know what? Pack everything away and get on home. Said what Mr. Warren does, he grabs a wet cloth and decides to wash and scrub the chalked graffiti off the wall before anyone could know what it said. Now, fortunately for us, around this time, this commotion was taking place between Mr. Warren and the photographer. 2 journalists happened to be on Golson Street at that time. They were lucky to get close to what the graffiti said. They scribbled it down in their notepads, which they then later published in their papers, the newspapers they worked for. And the graffiti said, "The Jews are the men who will not be blamed for nothing. The Jews are the men who will not be blamed for nothing." Simply meaning that the Jews are responsible, but they will not be blamed. Golson Street, at the time, had a very large Jewish community that established itself here during that migration period in the 1800s. We spoke about immigrants coming here back at the time with this idea of a better life for the Industrial Revolution taking place in the East End of London. The Jewish community set themselves here in Golson Street and largely around Whitechapel. There were other smaller minority groups. I mean, we're talking about people from all over the world: Romania, Poland, Hungary, Bulgaria, Germany, even Denmark, probably everywhere. They came here and they made their own small communities. Now, it could be argued that Charles Warren, the reason he decided to wash up the wall was to prevent an outcry from or even against the Jewish community at the time. There would have been riots on the streets. The police could not deal with that. They were understaffed and overworked, like I said. Plus they had to figure out, and they were too busy fighting with the City of London police force. That took up a lot of their time and resources. Now, the 2 journalists who wrote this quote, who managed to write down exactly what that said, they published in their papers, and this is kind of where this conspiracy begins to start. Because both journalists had a different spelling of the word Jews. So one paper spelled the word the way I would spell it, and I think most of us here would probably spell it, and that is J-E-W-S, right? J-E-W-S, Jews. The other paper, the other journalist spelled the word J-U-W-E-S. J-U-W-E-S. That is a very particular type of spelling of the word. It is in fact the Masonic spelling of the word Jews, and by that I mean of the Freemasons. Now the Freemasons, they're a very secret bunch, aren't they? From what I can tell you, the Freemasons are a secret fraternity of sorts, where there is a social and educational side to them, as well as having said to be very well connected to those in power and those with incredibly vast amounts of money. They have been linked into our history, and they go as far back as the time of the Illuminati, and they are said to go even further back in our history since the times of the Knights Templar. So a very ancient, very secret brotherhood, if you will. If anyone here plays video games and has heard of Assassin's Creed, that is pretty much what that game is about. Just these ancient brotherhoods. That is exactly what it is. They even made it into a film of the same name, Assassin's Creed, starring Michael Fassbender. Do not watch it. It was a bit of a disappointment and does not do the game's justice. As much as we all love Michael Fassbender, I'm sure we all love him, just not enough to carry the film through. Now, just on the subject of the Freemasons, Queen Victoria, the Queen of England, who sat on the throne at the time, she had a Freemason doctor, a man called William Gull. Now, William Gull was not only Queen Victoria's personal physician and surgeon, but he was also known and regarded as an advisor to the Queen. So she would consult with him about social and political matters about England and the country happening at the time. So people knew that he was in her inner circle, and they knew that he had a very large influence on the Queen. I'm going to come back to him in just a moment, because there's another member of the royal family I want to bring into the story, and that is one of Queen Victoria's grandchildren, a grandson. Back then he liked to be known as Prince Eddie. Prince Eddie had a very particular hobby. So during the day, you would see him around the palace fulfilling all of his royal duties and responsibilities. But by night, Prince Eddie would actually sneak out of the palace, dress himself down into commoner's clothes. He would come here into Whitechapel, where he was going to drink and gamble his night away. That's right. Prince Eddie loved to party. If you imagine a 19th century, or rather, if you imagine a very young Prince Harry back in the day. Of course, we all know what Prince Harry used to do. A few of his tabloids, front page newspaper reportings. That is what Prince Eddie was like. Now, he would spend the first part of his night in Whitechapel, getting as high as he can in opium dens. He would then go on to sleep and try to sleep with as many prostitutes as he can for the rest of the night, before ultimately doing the walk of shame back towards the palace. Now, how much of any of these actions the Queen knew about Prince Eddie, we're not entirely sure. But we know that if she didn't, or even if she did, there came a point where she couldn't ignore them any longer, because rumors started to spread in Whitechapel, especially amongst the prostitutes in this area, that Prince Eddie might have fathered an illegitimate child with one of the prostitutes. Now, that would have caused a massive scandal back then. Huge. Scandals were not very common in the 1800s, especially on the royal family. Today, I would say we're somewhat used to scandals, especially since 2016, when Brexit happened, and then the thing in the States. There has been pretty much a scandal every single day. My point with that is that we are now used to scandals. We're so used to them, we almost expect them. They don't surprise us anymore. Back then, they were not in any way near as common. Now, especially if it was on the royal family. Now, it is said that a few of the prostitutes in Whitechapel heard of this rumor, and they decided to get together, the canonical five in question, the victims, and it is said that they tried to use this rumor to blackmail Queen Victoria. Now, bear in mind, these women were incredibly poor, so they had nothing to lose in their eyes. They thought the Queen would play along, but Queen Victoria did not play along. Instead, what she did was she hired the services of her dear old friend and good old doctor, William Gull. Now, as I said, William Gull was not only the Queen's personal doctor and physician, which meant that he would have had an incredibly extensive knowledge of the body to actually perform operations on the Queen, but he also had access, very easy access, to surgical equipment, like that of a surgical knife, something that could cut and very easily slice into flesh. Think back to what I was saying about Catherine Eddowes with this theory of the killer maybe being a doctor, or at least a surgeon of some kind. This ties in very well with William Gull. Now, it is believed in this conspiracy that Queen Victoria ordered William Gull to come into Whitechapel, where he was to silence these women one by one, and he was ordered to do so in a style that resembled that of a sacrificial, ritualistic, Masonic style of killing at the time, which was to cut the victim's throats, rip them open and tear out and remove their organs, very much like the Ripper victims were found themselves. What I've just described to you here is known as the Royal Conspiracy. It has been a theory circling around since the very early 1900s. It became very popular during the 1970s when someone wrote a book claiming this was the true identity of Jack the Ripper. Since then, it has been widely discredited. I believe simply because it is a conspiracy theory on the royal family, and of course it paints their name in a very, very bad light. We are going further into Whitechapel now. If anyone who was near the back of the group didn't hear me, that road that just by the Bell pub that we crossed, that was the border between the City of London and Whitechapel. So we are now in Whitechapel. As we head further into it, you're probably wondering at this point where the name Jack the Ripper comes from. How did this serial killer get this name? It's very catchy, definitely very memorable, sticks in your head. Follow me just a few minutes down the road, I'll tell you where the name comes from, just this way. Alright, so Jack the Ripper. We're here to talk about the name. Nothing specifically relevant about this location, but just because it's a nice little stop. Before I talk about where the name came from, I want to talk about where this image of Jack the Ripper started. So usually when I talk about Jack the Ripper, people tend to have this image in their minds of what this serial killer looks like. So a lot of people tend to have this image of a fine English gentleman, perhaps, maybe wearing a top hat. He has a walking cane, very well dressed, has some sort of black cloak, something along those lines. You've definitely seen that image at least somewhere, right?
Yeah.
Excellent. Okay. Do you know where you get this picture from? Where this image came from? So that image has been incepted in our minds since 1927 by no one other than Alfred Hitchcock. So in 1927, Alfred Hitchcock directed a film called The Lodger. And it's set in London, and it's very similar to the Ripper murders. It's about a very fine, very mysterious English gentleman who comes into the East End of London, stays in a lodging house, and since his arrival, women have been found murdered on the streets of the East End. And the landlady who this lodger is staying with suspects that it is this man that is the murderer, the killer behind these poor women. Now, Alfred Hitchcock never at any point specifically said that this was about the Ripper murders, but because of the audience that went to see this film in 1927, it's 39 years since the murders themselves. So the kids and the children that were in the East End at the time who saw this film later in their adult life, they instantly made that connection back to the Ripper murders. It was like a trigger. And since then, that picture of this very fine English gentleman has been sort of the general image for what Jack the Ripper might have looked like. If you get a chance to watch it, I do recommend it. It's not a bad watch. It's quite old. It's only about 80 minutes long, so it shouldn't take up too much of your time. Now, the name itself, does anyone know where the name comes from? So the name came from a letter, basically. Now, after the second Ripper victim was found, the police started to receive hundreds and hundreds of letters. I mean, hundreds were pouring in every single week, all claiming to have some sort of information about the victims, all claiming to have some sort of information about the location of where the victim was found, that they were there, some sort of witness. Others were, most of the letters were written as if it was from the killer themselves. Now, this particular letter was sent in on the 27th of September. It is known as the Dear Boss letter. Simply because of the quantity of letters that the police received, they had to regard each and every single one of their letters, of the letters they received, as a fake, as a hoax. It was impossible for the police to follow up after every single letter that they got. They just didn't have enough resources. Now, they did read every letter they got, but they just filed it away straight after. They didn't really take it any serious. Now, this letter was sent in on the 27th of September. And this letter goes on to taunt the police about how badly of an investigation they're doing, how far away they are from finding this killer. And in one of the final comments, the author writes about a detail of what he's going to do next to his victim. And that detail that is mentioned is he will cut the ears off that victim. Catherine Eddowes had her earlobes cut off the victim in Mitre Square, and it was that detail that brought this letter back into the attention, into the eyes of the Metropolitan Police. Now, this letter was discovered later on that it had been sent in by a journalist. Yeah, a man called Thomas Bulling. He sent it in order to increase his own readership of his paper. So I guess it could be said that this letter had been generated by the press. Somehow they were able to get one tiny detail right. The police got hold of that detail. They then released this letter to the press, where they could officially publish it in their papers, and that is exactly what they did. Once the press were able to obtain a copy of this letter, they printed it in their newspapers, either in its entirety or certain sections which they thought were relevant to their article. But one section was printed in every single newspaper at the time in the whole country, and that was the signature of the letter. Yours truly, Jack the Ripper. Jack? Why Jack? Well, Jack was the most common name of the time. They called everything and anything they could have Jack. I'm not kidding. That's why we have Jack the Lad, Jack of all trades, Jack in a box. Sailors who were born into their profession were known as Jack Tar. And the Ripper part, that one is quite self-explanatory. It's just simply from the truly awful, tragic way that this killer violently ripped apart his victims and mutilated their organs, especially the sexual organs. So that's how the name Jack the Ripper came to be. Because it was printed in every single newspaper as the headline, it was everywhere. Like the name stuck in the public's minds. They saw it everywhere, and it was actually one of the very first times that any British newspaper were able to sell over 1 million copies in the country, which was a huge milestone for them, considering that many people here in the East End and in London in general were still very illiterate. They couldn't really read or write. So that's where the name itself came from, Jack the Ripper. So it was only after the night of the double event that this name came to be used. Before, for the first two victims, he was simply known as the killer of Whitechapel or the Whitechapel murderer. It was only from October onwards that the name Jack the Ripper started to be used. Favorite part of the tour, simply because we are right in the heart of Whitechapel now. As you can tell from the buildings, they are very old-fashioned, very brick-like Victorian style buildings. This place has been untouched since Victorian London, since the murders actually happened. So the way you're seeing these buildings now, this is exactly the buildings that were here when the Ripper murders happened, and when these alleyways were surrounded by, just overpopulated with the people of Whitechapel. If you look at the brick building just behind you, opposite me, just above the dermatography clinic and Neil Barber's house, this brick building used to be one of the old DOS houses I talked about at the beginning of the tour. And it was from this DOS house that the last sighting of Annie Chapman happened. When a man looked out the window from the DOS house and saw Annie Chapman being escorted down Puma Court with an unknown man. Now, in terms of the victims, Annie Chapman was the second Ripper victim. So the way we've covered the victims tonight, we did start with the first, that was Polly Ann Nichols on the 31st of August. We then went to victims number 3 and 4, the night of the double event. Now on the 30th of September, now we've kind of just gone back in time a little bit to the 8th of September, just to fill in that gap. Now, Annie Chapman, just to give you a bit of history on Annie Chapman, she was 47 years of age when she was murdered. She had been divorced for about 4 years from her husband, John Chapman. It was said to be a mutual divorce. We're not entirely sure of the exact reason behind the divorce, but a lot of people suspect it was because her husband, John, just had enough of Annie Chapman just being drunk all the time in their relationship. Annie Chapman was never considered to be an alcoholic. She was just simply regarded as really like drinking. She just really liked drinking. But she was never regarded or considered to be an alcoholic. Take that as you will. She was only 5 feet high. A very small woman, very shy, very quite introverted as a person until she had a drink, which according to her husband was all the time. When she got drunk, she was fierce, she was loud, she was obnoxiously loud and aggressive as well, quite physically aggressive. She was not afraid to voice her opinion and physically express her opinion with the people around her at the pub. Now, she wasn't found in Puma Court. She was seen being escorted down Puma Court about a few minutes further down the road at 29 Hanbury Street. We're not there just because it is a very narrow pedestrian road. It is on a main road as well, so you would not be able to hear me speak. Also, it's a Friday night and there are just tons of people out. But if you want, at the end of the tour, if you're around the area, go and check it out, because it's really nearby. It's just about literally 3 minutes down the road. Yeah, just down there to the left and then take a right. If you want, I can kind of show you at the end if anyone is willing. I'm happy to take you. She was found in the courtyard of 29 Hanbury Street by the third floor resident of that building, a man called John Davis. John Davis woke up that night, went to get himself a glass of water. When he looks out into the window, down into the courtyard, he can see that there's this woman. In the very faint sort of morning light, you can see that there's this woman hunched over, sort of doubled over herself on the ground in the courtyard. Now, he simply assumed that she was hungover. She had a heavy night of drinking. On her way home, she kind of stumbled into the courtyard and just passed out and fell asleep in the courtyard. So he decides to go down into the courtyard to wake her up. As he descends the steps into the courtyard and walks up to her body, he grabs her by the shoulder and gives her a quick shake. As he does this, he notices that her body feels quite cold and it feels very stiff as well. He grabs her shoulder again to turn her over to see if she was okay. As he did that, is in that moment where he realized that she had been gutted by Jack the Ripper, or rather the killer of Whitechapel, since the name Jack the Ripper didn't exist at this time. She had been strangled to death, the same as the other victims. Her throat was cut all the way across. She had been ripped open down her middle. As John Davis grabbed her shoulder to turn her over, in that motion, her guts and her innards just spilled onto the floor beside her body. When the police came, they found that her uterus had been completely cut and removed out. Her rings, she loved jewellery, by the way. Anytime I loved jewellery, she wore multiple rings on all of her fingers. All of these rings had been removed and placed in a pile by the body as well. Which is very interesting detail. Not sure how relevant it is to the actual murder or the killer, but it's just a very interesting, curious side note as to why the killer would have had time or even dedicated time to removing the jewellery specifically. If anything, it just shows that it wasn't a robbery or a mugging gone wrong. This was a cold-hearted murder. As well as her organs by the body, her uterus being cut out, the police also found another little piece of evidence. A blood-stained leather apron on the fence of the courtyard. Now, when that little bit of information was released to the press and the people started to read about it, rumours started to circle and speculate around the prostitutes in Whitechapel that the killer might be someone who was locally known as the Leather Apron. The Leather Apron was just a local thug. He was a local Whitechapel brute. He would go around, beat people up, he would take their money, he would physically, even sometimes sexually abuse the women, especially the prostitutes in Whitechapel. So he seemed like a good candidate to be the killer. There was a small problem in that allegation, and that was that the leather apron, the actual garment, that happened to be the Jewish garment of choice. We spoke a little bit about the Jewish community having established itself here in Whitechapel during the 1800s. There was a lot of anti-Semitism back then, around that time, a lot more than I'd like to think there is today. If the police were to come out to the public to say that the killer was the leather apron, the public would have taken that as the police telling them the killer was Jewish. Again, the police did not want riots. They could not do that. Now, they did bring in and question this man, the leather apron, for several hours, at which point they then released him simply on the grounds that there wasn't enough evidence to pin him to this crime. Also, he had two very strong alibis for both nights of the two murders that happened up to this point. So he was actually released from the custody. Now, at the previous stop, I spoke about letters being sent to the police, about hundreds of letters being sent in. We spoke about the Dear Boss letter, which is how we got the name Jack the Ripper. There is another letter that I want to talk to you about now. It is arguably probably the most famous of any of the letters regarding or involving this particular case. It's known as the From Hell letter. They did actually make, again, there's a film of the same name, From Hell, starring Johnny Depp, which again is very loosely based on the Ripper murders. Too much CGI, not really worth your time. I wouldn't recommend watching it. If you do want good documentaries or TV series that sort of talk about the Ripper murders, talk to me at the end, because I'm happy to give you a few suggestions. and my own recommendations. Now, in terms of the letter, the From Hell letter, Scotland Yard have the original copy to this date in their vaults. I did email them to see if they could let me borrow it for my tours. I think my email got lost in their junk folder or something because they never replied. They're busy. So luckily for us, there's this amazing thing called the internet, and I was able to print off 2 copies for you so you can kind of see now. Being an actor, I do like my props. So, to give you a bit of context on the letter, you will probably see from a distance that it's not exactly the most legible. I will pass them out, so don't worry if you can't see it all together. They're not exactly the most legible. I have transcribed it up at the top for you, should you wish to read exactly what the letter says. So again, this letter was sent in on the 15th of October, 1888, after 2 weeks since the night of the double event. I'll just pass them around there, and then they can meet somewhere in the middle. It reads, "From Hell. Mr. Lusk, Sir, I send you half the kidney I took from one woman, preserved it for you. T'other piece I fried and ate it. Was very nice. I may send you the bloody knife that took it out, if only you wait a while longer. Signed, catch me when you can, Mr. Lusk." So, who is Mr. Lusk? I'm not mispronouncing Mr. That is exactly how the author of this letter wrote the word Mr. Mr. George Lusk was the chairman of the Council of Whitechapel during the time these murders were taking place. Now, he received this letter himself, personally, not the police. He received this letter at his own home. With that letter, he received a package. When he opened up that package in his drawing room that evening, found wrapped in a piece of bloodied cloth, he found a human kidney, or at least a piece of human kidney, as the letter describes. Now, if I received a human kidney, I'd be freaking out. It's a little bit different than your standard Amazon Prime package you're probably used to receiving nowadays, or even any organ for that matter is a bit traumatizing for me. Like I said, I don't deal very well with blood. George Lusk opens up this box, this package, looks at the piece of kidney inside this box, stares at it for several seconds before going, closes the box back up, throws it into his desk drawer where he leaves it there for the rest of the day. Yeah, not exactly my first reactions either. Now, he does take this box around the local surgeries of Whitechapel to determine whether or not it was in fact a human kidney, or if it was maybe a prank or a joke or a hoax of some sort that he maybe suspected at the time of receiving it. He very quickly comes to this realization that it was in fact a real human kidney that he was given. At that point, he freaks out. He loses it. Not because the fact that it's a human kidney, but because he received it personally. He became terrified for the safety of his family and children, because this killer, or this author of this letter, knew where he lived. At this point, he gets in touch with the Metropolitan Police Force. He passes on this letter with the package to the Met Police. Now, at this point in their investigation, they decide to hire the services of a graphologist. Graphology is the study of handwriting. The graphologist, who's left in charge to decipher this letter, studies the handwriting of the letter, comes back with the conclusion to the police that the handwriting of this letter showed psychotic tendencies. Now, I could have told you that simply from reading the contents of the letter, if you ask me, let alone having to study the handwriting exactly. But one thing is very interesting. It is not so much what the graphologist found, is what I just said. It is the content of the letter. The author writes about a kidney, which was received with the letter itself. This is 2 weeks after the murder of Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes. Catherine Eddowes had a kidney missing from the crime scene where her body was found in Mitre Square, where we were about an hour ago. Unfortunately, because of the lack of forensics and the technology that they had at the time, it is impossible for the police to determine and conclude whether or not this kidney was in fact Catherine Eddowes, which is why this letter is still to this day one of the most speculated about and probably the most famous in regards to the Ripper investigation. Yeah, of course. You guys have been fantastic. We have one more stop, is just across the road over there in Spitalfields Market. I'll talk about the final victim of Jack the Ripper and of course one final suspect before we call it a night. This market, that road there, that road is called Rushden Street. Behind that road there was a road known as Dorset Street back in the 1800s. And on Dorset Street there was a building known as Miller's Court. 13 Miller's Court. The unlucky number, of course, being 13, at the time in 1888 was rented by Mary Jane Kelly. Mary Jane Kelly sets herself apart from the other victims for two main reasons. She was only 25 years of age when she was murdered. 25 years old. She was also the only Ripper victim to have her own room. All the other Ripper victims, all the other prostitutes were usually spend the night out on the streets or they went to a doll's house. Mary Jane Kelly had somewhere that she could call home. Now, she did not stay in this room on her own. She had help. She was staying in this room with her boyfriend at the time, a man called Joseph Barnett. Joseph Barnett was just a local fishmonger here in the area. Now, they rented that room together, but they were struggling to pay the rent on time. It was discovered after she was found that they were about 6 weeks behind on their rent. Mary Jane Kelly was a very shy person, very introverted, kept to herself, didn't really, push herself out to socialize that much. Very kind woman as well, until she got drunk. When she had a few drinks, that personality did a complete 180 degrees. She became aggressive, violent. Her favorite thing that she loved doing when she was drunk, fist fights. She loved a good brawl. She loved getting into a good fist fight. Man, woman, or child, did not matter. Probably not child, but definitely man or woman. She loved a good brawl. For that reason, her friends gave her the nickname Dark Mary or Black Mary. I'm assuming simply just from the bruises that she had all over her body from these fights. Now, on the 9th of November 1888, she was outside the 10 Bells pub, just across the road where we crossed the traffic lights. Outside the pub, not so much in this fighting, drunken, aggressive mood, more in a jolly singing type of mood. We all have one friend that knows, that we know that is in this very singing, jolly, drunken mood. She was outside the 10 Bells pub singing a song and drinking a glass of gin. When she finished singing that song, she approached a man by the name of George Hutchinson and asked him if he could lend her some money. He simply replied, "I'm sorry, it is beyond my means." George Hutchinson, in his report to the police, said that Mary Jane Kelly then approached a different man outside the pub and he saw them start a conversation. A few hours pass. He sees them still together inside the pub this time, talking together, laughing together, generally sort of getting on with one another, enjoying each other's company. A few moments pass, they get up, walk out the 10 Bells pub and head into what appears to be Mary Jane Kelly's room. That was the last time anyone saw Mary Jane Kelly alive. I'm going to skip forward a little bit to the next morning now, when the landlord of the entire building of Miller's Court, a man called John McCarthy, he was also a stall owner here in the market at the time. Now, he was here getting his stall ready for the day of business ahead very early, when one of the other residents of Miller's Court approaches him and says that they heard a cry last night of "Oh, murder! Oh, murder!" coming from what seemed to be Mary Jane Kelly's room. Now, John McCarthy is a very intelligent man. He can read, he can write. He's not only a stall owner here in the market, he's also the landlord of the entire building. And I found this out very recently. He actually used to be a gangster, or considered as a gangster here in Whitechapel. He actually used to run and organize the underground fighting rings in this district. So definitely not a man that you would want to owe about 6 weeks of rent worth, or at least be behind with. He knew, he could read and write. He read the papers. He knew about the Ripper murders. He knew the dangers prostitutes were facing. He knew that Mary Jane Kelly worked as a prostitute. So he became concerned. He went to check on her to make sure that she was okay. As he approaches the door to 13 Miller's Court, which is at street level, he can instantly see that the door itself is locked from the inside. There is the curtains on the windows of the door have been drawn shut, so you can't see into the room. But there's a small broken window on the left side of the door. Now John McCarthy starts knocking, he starts yelling, trying to get Mary Jane Kelly to reply. There is no response. He then tries to catch a glimpse between the curtain of the door and the window just to see if he can look onto the bed. Maybe she was passed out, maybe she had a heavy night of drinking, she was simply incoherent of his cries. When he finally catches a glimpse into 13 Miller's Court, he jumps away from the door immediately. After a split second, he starts sprinting all the way down back here into the market as fast as he can, grabs some of these stall owners here also setting up that morning, drags them back to Miller's Court so they can act as a witness for him while he attempts to break the door down. When he finally breaks the door down into 13 Miller's Court, he would report to the police that all he could remember seeing was blood. The police report for Mary Jane Kelly's death is approximately 18 pages long. That's a very detailed, very extensive account of the crime scene. The police come to the room. As soon as they get to the door, they can instantly tell that the room itself is very, very small. As soon as you open the door into the room, it hits the side of the bed. The bed itself is a single bed that Mary Jane Kelly and Joseph Barnett would have had to have shared together. The only other furniture in the room was a small chair and table on the other end of the bed and a fireplace on the side. When the police enter the room, they find Mary Jane Kelly's body, or the remains of what was left of her body, on the bed on her back. She had been strangled to death. Her throat was cut all the way across, so deep it was almost decapitated. She had been ripped open down the middle of her torso. All of her organs had been ripped out cold and placed on the table at the other end of the bed. Her breasts had been sliced off and placed on either side of her head on the pillow. Her body had been skinned from head to toe. Her face was so badly beaten and cut, the police said that it was almost impossible to identify her when they came to the scene. Her blood was smeared in every single wall in that room. There was not a speck of wall in 13 Miller's Court that did not have Mary Jane Kelly's blood on it. Not only that, the Ripper takes it even a step further. He rips out Mary Jane Kelly's heart and removes it from the room. The police never found Mary Jane Kelly's heart. Now, we have here the most violent, most brutal murder that Jack the Ripper has committed so far. Now, that's not me saying that they are not equally as upsetting or as tragic as one another. What I'm simply saying with that is that this one was simply more violent, considerably more violent than the other murders that he's done up to this point. There are two main reasons for this. First, we have to take a small look at certain patterns of modern day serial killers. No one has ever born a killer. Now, usually when these people tend to decide to kill for the first time, everything's a bit of a blur. They just kind of black out everything. The adrenaline's pumping. They do the first thing that naturally comes to their mind. Now, once that adrenaline subsides, it simmers down, they realize what they've done, that adrenaline churns in them. And it turns into this feeling of pleasure, this feeling of sexual release, and they feel euphoric. They have never felt this elated ever in their existence. And if they get away with it the first time they've killed, they start to think to themselves, well, can I kill again? Because I want that feeling again and again and again, and it becomes like a drug to them. Now, with drugs, the more that you regularly do a specific drug, the more of a tolerance, the more of a resistance you build up to that drug. It is no longer enough for you to take the same amount. You need more and more to get the same effect. The same thing applies to serial killers. It's no longer enough for them to do exactly the same thing that they did with their previous victim. They just don't get that rush anymore. It gets boring. They start thinking to themselves, well, how can I get this feeling again? Maybe if I cut off a finger, maybe if I tear them apart, maybe if I remove an organ or a limb or anything like that, they'll get that feeling. And we see that escalation with the Ripper victims themselves. Let's go back to Polly Ann Nichols. She had her throat cut and she had been stabbed in her abdomen. We then go to Annie Chapman, where he then cuts her throat and then slices her open, cutting out the uterus. Skipping over Elizabeth Stride with this idea that he was interrupted, we then go to Catherine Eddowes, where he tears her apart, rips out her intestines over her shoulders and removes her kidney almost like a trophy. We then go to the final victim, Mary Jane Kelly, where he completely tears and shreds her apart. We see that escalation in the Ripper murders, in the Ripper victims themselves. The other reason as to why this was the most violent murder, it was the only murder to happen inside. It wasn't out in open streets. The fact that this was behind a locked door, somewhere away from prying eyes, gave Jack the Ripper more time and more privacy to do what he wanted, how he wanted it to happen. There weren't going to be any interruptions this time. No disturbances, no one walking in on them by accident. Now, I'm going to go back a little bit to the locked door of the room, because this kind of hinges the final theory of the final suspect of tonight, and that is Joseph Barnett, Mary Jane Kelly's boyfriend. So, who was Joseph Barnett? Joseph Barnett was a local fisherman. Like I said, he was a local boy, grew up here in Whitechapel. He was said to be a very intelligent, very smart man. He could read, he could write, and he was also it was well known among the community here that he loved Mary Jane Kelly. He loved her a lot, so much that he actually started to steal fish from the market where he worked, so they could save that money that they would spend on food to go towards the rent that was overdue. Now, that resulted in him losing his job because he was caught stealing. Now, he lost his job in the summer of 1888, and since then, after that time, he didn't find another job. He became unemployed. He spent the rest of his days drinking at the pub all day, coming back late in the evening, where he would spend his evenings reading Mary Jane Kelly, the newspaper. Mary Jane Kelly couldn't read and write. Joseph Barnett could, and he would read to her in the evenings about the stabbings and the beatings that were happening in Whitechapel during the course of that summer. And that made Mary Jane Kelly concerned. It made her fear for her own safety working on the streets. Joseph Barnett saw that fear, and his mind started to work. He started to think to himself, how can I take things into my own hands? Now, why would he want to take things into his own hands? Like I just said a moment ago, he loved Mary Jane Kelly. That was a very well-known fact in this area. It was also a well-known fact that he hated Mary Jane Kelly for the reason that she worked as a prostitute on the streets. He was very jealous. He was a very controlling and possessive boyfriend. He believed that if he worked hard enough at the market, that he could provide for the both of them, so she wouldn't have to work on the streets. Now, that was the case until he got caught for stealing. When he became unemployed, Mary Jane Kelly went back on the streets so she could provide in turn for the both of them. Now, a week before her murder, an argument happened in their room when Joseph Barnett came home to find Mary Jane Kelly having brought back home a homeless prostitute. Not a customer, a homeless prostitute, to give her a roof over her head for that one night. This woman had nowhere else to go. She was in incredibly poor health. She just needed a bed for one night. Joseph Barnett was so furious by this that this argument escalated. It was heard all over the entire building of Miller's Court. Angry and frustrated, he walks over to the table, grabs his set of keys, and storms out 13 Miller's Court. Apart from Mary Jane Kelly, Joseph Barnett was the only other person to have a set of keys to this door. The landlord himself, John McCarthy, did not have keys. He had to break the door down and have witnesses to see him break the door down. Now that could explain as to how the door came to be locked. The other explanation, the only other possible explanation it could be, is from the window on the left side of the door, the fact that it was broken. If you remember, there was the broken window. Now, the police said it was possible the killer could have reached through this window and locked the door with the key still on the inside of the room. However, they thought it was very unlikely because it was a very, very long reach to go through the side window all the way to reach the lock. It's possible, but they found it highly unlikely. Now, I realize that I've spoken about death and murder for the last 2 and a bit hours, so I do apologize. I will finish this tour on a high note for you, so you can enjoy your weekends. And that came in the aftermath of Mary Jane Kelly's death. Now, when the time for a funeral came, thousands of people came out on the streets to pay their respects for Mary Jane Kelly. So much so, it turned into a movement, a social movement for change in London. A petition have been signed and sent directly to Queen Victoria herself, saying if you don't do anything, not just about the murders in Whitechapel, but about the poverty, the living conditions, the genuine filth and overpopulated area of this district, there will be riots. Not just in Whitechapel, not just in London, but all over the country. The people and the public were furious with the Queen and the government. Well, Queen Victoria listened and she acted immediately. In fact, one of the first things she did for this area, she installed street lighting in every single part and street corner of this entire district, which I believe was one of the very first stepping stones into turning Whitechapel in the trendy, edgy, as much as that gentleman at the beginning of the tour disagreed with me, part of London that we are standing in tonight. Now, you might not have seen any hipsters yet, but you still have time as you walk towards the stations. So, just to give you a recap and a quick summary of everything that I've talked on tonight about the victims and the suspects. Our first victim was Polly Ann Nichols on the 31st of August 1888, found over in Bucks Row, which is now known as Durward Street. We then go to the 8th of September, where Annie Chapman was found at 29 Henry Street, just a few minutes past Puma Court, where we were a moment ago. We then go all the way to the 30th of September, 1888, the night of the double event, the night that Jack the Ripper claimed the lives of not just one, but two victims. First being Elizabeth Stride at exactly 1 a.m, and then 45 minutes later, where he murders Catherine Eddowes in Mitre Square, where we were in the tour today. And then the final victim is Masterpiece, if you will. Mary Jane Kelly, murdered in her very own room at 13 Miller's Court, just opposite Brushfield Street, just over there on Dorset Street. Savagely ripped apart and killed. We've spoken a lot about suspects and theories as to who Jack the Ripper might be. So, was Jack the Ripper a soldier or a sailor from afar? Could he have been Montague Druitt, the school teacher, solicitor that I spoke about at the beginning of the tour? Maybe we're looking on a grander scale. Maybe we're looking at someone who's connected to the royal family. Maybe it's a royal conspiracy in the shape of William Gull, Queen Victoria's personal doctor and physician. Maybe it's not so much on a bigger scale, maybe it's on a local scale. The local thug of Whitechapel, the leather apron. Or maybe not only is it someone local, but someone who has a direct relationship with one of the victims. Could it be Joseph Barnett, the jealous, controlling fisherman boyfriend of Mary Jane Kelly? Now, what I've touched on tonight is simply the tip of a colossally huge iceberg underneath. It is impossible to fit everything on this case in a 2-hour tour, as I'm very clearly demonstrating to you now. Like I said, they've made a whole university degree out of it. It's called Ripperology. If you're interested, either go and study it or just look up things online. If anyone would like to find more information on the murders or the victims or anything about the case, a very credible website that I used for a lot of my research was casebook.org. Jack the Ripper Casebook, just look it up on any search engine. It should be in the first 5 links to show up. You can even have dissertations of ripperologists that they've submitted. You can even vote on who you think the killer is, which I find a little disturbing and uncomfortable, but it is interesting just to see who other people think the killer is. Now, if you came tonight to answer the question I set out to you at the beginning, who was Jack the Ripper? I'm really sorry to disappoint you, but I cannot say, because I do not know. No one to this day knows who this serial killer is, and I hope it remains that way. I'll tell you why, because once we know the identity of the killer, all of the attention and all the focus will go on them. Who they were, where they were from, how they committed these murders, why they committed these murders, and how were they able to escape and evade capture. And in that process, we forget about the people's lives, the people of Whitechapel, and the women, the victims themselves, who fell and died at the hands of this awful serial killer. The fact that his identity is a mystery allows me as a tour guide to tell you these women's stories, so their memory can go on, so they will not be forgotten. The fact that I don't glorify the serial killer pays respect to these women. But that's my take on it. You guys have been fantastic. This is the end of the tour. My name is Victor with Wonders of London. Jack the Ripper Tour, thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.
If you like this video, please subscribe my YouTube channel London Diary